Killeen. I am the author. Oh, broadcast is live. Hello, my name is Matt Killeen. I am the author of Orphan Monster Spy and its sequel, Devil Darling Spy. This is the beautiful US cover by Christian Boyle. The Will Steele British covers with the lovely shiny foil. I'm going to be talking a little bit about Devil Darling Spy. If there's time, I'm going to read a little bit from it, but mainly I'm going to be talking about the inspiration and how it ties into colonialism and imperialism. Now I'm going to try and share my screen. You probably won't see me again for the rest of the thing. Here we go. Now, allow. Okay. Now, hopefully you can all see this. Now, first of all, very important, the content warnings for this. There are distressing images, there are depictions of brutality, images of death, torture, racism, conversations about sexual violence and violence to Black bodies. And I believe that these are necessary to discuss this properly, but please do not subject yourself to anything that you think is going to be particularly triggering. I also think that for a lot of people watching this, you know, the reaction is going to be, no shit, Sherlock, we know all this. And I think this is, it's going to be painfully obvious. But this is the story of my journey and how it formed the book. It's based on the school talk for the book, so some of the facts are a bit facty, and it also may seem very familiar to a lot of us after the last 18 months. I also say as I go along that I knew about most of it, but I didn't get it. I didn't really truly understand it. I knew the facts, but I didn't feel it until I started work on this book. And because this isn't in schools, it means I don't have to hold back, so strap in. Now, Orphan Monster Spy was the story of a Jewish German girl who was orphaned in an escape attempt, who she runs into a British agent who she saves and then goes undercover for him in a school for the daughters of elite Nazis. A school book, Mallory Towers' Nazis is the way that I heard somebody say. Now, Orphan Monster Spy took place in 1939, the first year of the war, and it was like the first year of Sarah's war. And for the continuation of Sarah's story, I always envisioned the story taking place in like 1940. Now, 1940, we know these stories actually very well. The Phony War, Attack Through the Ardennes, the Fall of France, and then we have like Dunkirk, and then the Battle of Britain. And certainly if you're British, these are stories that we know very, very well. And we don't necessarily need to hear this story again, particularly right now for reasons that, you know, I'll go into. But then I came across this book by David Olusoga and Casper Eriksson, The Kaiser's Holocaust. By virtue of leaving the radio on in the shower, you can hear, and I heard this and my ears pricked up and I was like, well, you know, that it deals with the Nama and Herero genocide, which took place by the German Empire. That's the Kaiser's Empire at the very start of the 20th century. And this sounded eerily like the Holocaust to me, and so it proved. Now, the Kaiser was an entitled little shit in many ways. He lacked the wisdom of his father, whose reign only lasted a couple of months because he died of cancer, and Wilhelm took over, and he was young and naive and really fancied himself. And you know, he would go on to be one of the reasons that the whole world fell into war in the Great War. Now, he and the newly unified Germany wanted an empire, like everybody else had. The only land available in an African continent carved up by the European powers was a strip of land in southwest Africa, and it was bordered by the Namib Desert on the coast and the Kalahari, or what they call the Amheki, further in. And so it was difficult to reach. People hadn't really made an effort to take it over. Now, the Nama and Herero people were unimpressed with the newcomers. They were wealthy, happy, and by Western standards, extremely sophisticated. You know, they had met Westerners before. They had liked the clothes. They bought them. They lived in houses. All the stuff that you are primed to not think about people in Africa. Yeah, so they like, they were not going to hand over land or protection treaties or trinkets, and so you know, they weren't much fussed by these new German settlements either. There was a lot of land, none of it very good, and all the normal ways in which a European country would take over another part of the world weren't really available. Then Rinderpest, and I will come back to this, circle back around to this later. Rinderpest made its way up from the Cape, and for people for whom cattle was wealth and food, this was disastrous. In one fell swoop, huge numbers were driven into poverty. The German settlers offered a chance for paid work, and many took it, even work that was servants, laborers, you know, a change in the social structure. By the time the herds had recovered, the balance of power had completely changed. One chief signed away some land for military aid in an internal dispute, and then the Germans had their claws into the territory. And what followed was a sharp increase in abuses, thefts, and murders committed by the settlers. The Herero and the Nama in many places were now dependent on the settlers, and they took the mistreatment. But the settlers began to swallow land, and eventually the Nama and Herero rebelled. Now, this painting is German propaganda. The settlers and their European troops got their ass handed to them over and over and over again. The Nama and Herero knew the ground and outfought the Germans completely. All right. Then came along General von Trotter. Now, he's a monster. I mean, the settlers were entitled imperialist racists. It's just what they were, what many people were at that point. But it's safe to say that von Trotter, he enjoyed killing. Now, the Herero and the Nama fought a decent war. They respected civilians and prisoners, and the Germans did not. When they caught the Nama Herero, they hung them in many places. This is a postcard. This is the kind of thing you would send home. And von Trotter had just taken possession of some Gatling guns. This is a leaps and bounds technological advance. What he needed was a large-scale battle to use it. He made peace overtures, and the Herero gathered on the edge of the Amaheki, that's the Kalahari Desert, to hear his terms. Now, this wasn't as naive as it sounds, because after any internal war, the losing side would settle peace terms, and then everybody would go back to business as usual. This is what they expected. They had won the war by any measure. Now, the battle that followed was a complete massacre because of the machine guns. And the Herero tried to withdraw, but found nowhere to go but the desert. And so the men, women, and children were pursued, unable to stop. Without food and water, they eventually fell to the side and died, or they were then shot by the Germans. They were captured in small numbers, but overwhelmingly died of starvation or exposure. And just for the avoidance of doubt, this is an extermination order. Any Herero found inside the German frontier, with or without a gun or cattle, will be executed. I shall spare neither women nor children. I shall give them the order to drive them away and fire on them. Driving women and children into the desert, that's murder, and it's practically coded. As it turns out, most of them were shot. But just like the Nazi order to drive, Russian Jewish women and children into the swamp, that meant they were going to die too. It's murder. Now, the remaining Herero and the Nama were rounded up, often by, this is one of their capture parties, often by offering safety and food, which then wasn't provided. They were carted off to the camps in trains. Is this starting to feel familiar yet? And they were crammed inside in their thousands in unsanitary conditions, in inclement weather. Jargon particularly was freezing cold, and they didn't have extra clothing or proper shelter, and they had knowingly inadequate food. And there they were worked until they died. If they weren't part of cruel medical experiments into scurvy, amongst other things, and then when they died, the camp doctors shipped off their heads and skulls to the museums of Europe. Still being debated now, there are teams of people rounding up these skulls and trying to return them to Namibia for burial. Now, the evidence of this is undeniable, although the German government only recently conceded what it was. This is genocide by current definition, not the dictionary definition, but the Article 2 of the Genocide Convention. Okay. And what chilled me here was the reaction of the other European powers to this atrocity. Crickets. British and South African condemnation of Germans' treatment of the Herero Nama in 1917 was belated and disingenuous. Britain's own record of colonial and genocidal violence later opened to charges of hypocrisy. Moreover, when the Herero and Nama wars, the British government had raised no objections to Germans' treatment of her imperial subjects, even warned. London had lodged no complaints. Nobody complained. This was, as far as they were concerned, poor behavior, but they didn't care. And that's because this is what empire is. It's the way of things. This is what empire means. It means some human beings are worth less than others, and you can do whatever you want with them. And I knew this, and I knew many of these details, but I didn't get it until that moment. I kept emerging from the room where I was reading this, steaming in anger. And I had to talk about this, because at this point, we're looking at 2016, 2018, nobody was talking about this at all. Nobody was really talking about empire. And at the same time, there was a groundswell of racist, right-wing politics in the UK and in the US. I live in a transatlantic household, so I tend to shift irresistibly from one of these to the other. So I had to talk about this somehow, and as a Brit, I feel the weight of the British Empire. I feel its blood on everything, because those camps, concentration camps, we, the British, invented them. We invented the concentration camp. We stuffed the Boers, the civilian women and children, into them after burning their farms, and there they starved. That is Lizzie Benson. She would go on to be one of the 26,000 who died. And say her name. This is a British member of Parliament, Conservative member of Parliament, Jacob Rees-Mogg, defending the use of concentration camps live on TV in 2019. That's Grace Blakely. She's an economist, but the look of horror on her face, and she did her level best. And he just talked her down. Oh, you're mixing it up, darling. It's not an extermination camp. It's just a concentration camp. But that's where we are now. Now, I had read Red Rubber before. Now, Red Rubber is it's a world-changing whistleblow on the horrors of the Congo Free State, where the Belgians turned blood into rubber with a disgusting 2 decades-long reign of terror. I also read Adam Hochschild's King Leopold's Ghost at this point, and that was even more painful. Now, if you are squeezed or traumatized, look away now. There are going to be images of violence to Black bodies that is frankly disgusting. Briefly, Belgium, at the behest of its King Leopold II, squeezed that territory for every possible cent it could get out of it, and by any means at all. At a point where most empires were becoming more paternalist and marginally less horrible, in theory at least, the Belgians ran a system of violence and murder that was slavery in everything but name. And if you did not work hard enough for your masters, they cut your children's hands off. And there was actually a thriving business in I can't even talk about this, in exchanging body parts as a form of currency. And that's a father looking at his children's limbs. Or they might beat you with a whip of dried rhino skin for any reason at all. If you weren't if you weren't starving to death, you have your village or farm burned down, it might just murder you, and that might even be the lucky situation. I'm going to read a little bit now from Devil Darling Spy. Sarah slammed the door open and the captain started, shoving something under his pillow. "Have you read this?" she shouted, waving Clementine's book in the air. He squinted at tiny pupils at the cover. Then he shrugged. "Yes, many years ago." "How do you sleep? How does anyone sleep? The Belgians, the victim Belgians are supposed to be on our side." Captain made shushing eyebrows and Sarah attempted to sit on her rage. She failed. "It's not that long ago," she continued. "And Clementine says nothing has changed and that the same kind of thing was happening here. Children getting their arms chopped off because their parents wouldn't work hard enough. Children!" Captain lost his state of calm and made an almost violent downward motion with his hands. His face contorted into something frenzied. Sarah paused and took a breath. "Sit and shush," he hissed. Sarah felt like she might throw the book at him. Then she let her arms drop to her sides. Her eyes continued to burn. She sat on the edge of the bed and folded her arms over the book, her nails pressed into its surface. Red rubber bought with African blood. Floggings with dried rhino hide were routine. Routine, she growled. Workers' tax, that's slavery. In the 20th century, villages burned to the ground, men flogged, women they for objecting. They couldn't farm, they starved, worked until they died. Severed hands were currency. Is this true? Is this really what happened? She whined the last part, wanting him, someone, to tell her this was a horrible myth. "Yes, it's all true," the captain said quietly, and he lay back on the bed. This wasn't a few villages. Half the population of Congo Free State died. Clementine says 10 million people. The French, the British, much the same? Probably. I don't know. And for the love of God, shush, he moaned. "Then who am I fighting for? You've already rounded up people and put them in camps. You've already worked whole villages to death. Why are the Wehrmacht so upset? All they're doing in Poland is what everyone's done here." "It's different," he mumbled. "We wouldn't do that now." Sarah demanded. "Look, they're just Africans." The captain stopped. He was actually panting. Sarah stared into his face. "I'm just a Jew," Sarah said quietly. "No, more than that." "More than? You mean that's not enough? They don't qualify as human. More than that." The captain's face pushed himself into a sitting position. "You know what? There have always been people, humans, who are worth less, not because they actually are, but because someone has put themselves on top and someone has to be at the bottom. It's the Jews or the Negroes or the poor, always the poor. And it's wrong, but this is how humanity functions. So what are we fighting for?" She gave an exaggerated shrug. "Why bother? You know as well as I do that the Nazis represent something more, something new, like having the Congo's force publique on the streets of Europe. Well, so that's special. That's different. We could do it all go to war for Europeans, for Jews, for white people. You think they'll stop with the Jews? You think the Nazis ruling Africa is going to be better than the Congo state was? Do you think the government who thinks that Slavs are subhuman is going to let them live happy and peacefully? No, Sarah Velsigren. Do you want to change the world? Start with the most overt, obvious enemy and worry about them first." "Hypocrites," she hissed. "Maybe. I don't know about you. I'm not a politician or a statesman. I'm a soldier. I'm a spy, an assassin, a murderer. I'm doing my job, my bit, and I'll continue to do what I can as long as you keep your godforgotten voice down." The figures for the dead in Congo Free State are up for debate. Sarah is quoting figures that were considered at the time. Adam Hochschild thinks 10 million dead is perfectly reasonable. 2005, maybe 75% of the population of Congo Free State died. That's the latest research. Either way, these are just figures that just bear, you cannot get your head around them. You know, and at no point should this be considered like replacing the Holocaust. You know, the Holocaust was a very specific kind of horror, and we have figures because there was paperwork. And just because we care now about the people of Congo Free State does not mean we don't care about the Holocaust too. I think it was the late great David Cesarani said to Lawrence Rees that the Holocaust was different because somebody said that they were going to wipe out an entire people within a specific period of time, and that technology and systems were created to do that. And that made it special and different. but there is enough anger for everybody. Now, I had to write about it somehow. Somehow, I had a book deal in which I could write a book, and people would read it. Some people would read it. People who read the last one would read it, and I had no idea how I was going to make that work. But research gave me the Battle of Libreville in Gabon. French fought each other, the Gaullists and the Vichyaites fought each other with black soldiers in Gabon, in what was then French Equatorial Africa. And yeah, there's a little window open there, a chance for me to talk about this. Now, at the same time I was creating this, I was thinking about the book. There was the appalling and tragic Ebola pandemic in West Africa, and it was inescapable. I'd made the connection between bioweapons and the rinderpest epidemic. There's no there's no evidence that happened in the book. I had made that connection. There's no evidence of that, but rinderpest is in fact a bioweapon for killing cattle. That's how it's been used many times, and it just seems so convenient that the Germans were able to build on this crisis, and so the fiction and the truth were beginning to merge in my head. I knew a lot about the Ebola because I have a dark, horrified fascination with the subject of disease, and I can trace this almost exactly to the at the channel ports in Britain. The rabies posters that used to feature there were terrifying. I mean, you know, rabid dogs attacking toddlers and skulls. Even the French word for rabies, la rage. You know, rabies means death, and it was the subject of numerous TV programs. And I was privileged enough to be holidaying in on the continent in France, and terrified the whole time. And you know, I to be stuff like Satan Bug, the Andromeda Strain. These were essential viewing from behind the sofa. You know, this is people on Anthrax Island in Britain, and you know, it did not help that the very last smallpox victim ever died in my hometown when I was a child, and died in my local hospital. And on top of that, there was a very big botulism poisoning scare. Did make some people very ill. I do believe somebody died, and has made me scared of dented cat episodes. And so I wanted to be a microbiologist, and I just don't have the science background for that. So that kind of left by the wayside. But I've always been fascinated, like through my fingers. And I had read Peter Payot's biography, No Time to Lose. Peter Payot was the first person to part of the team that first identified Ebola in Zaire, which is now the Democratic Republic of Congo. There he is. I think he's the tall guy. Not sure. He could be the guy who's cut off on the right hand side. And there's one of the first identified victims of Zaire. And Ebola and disease on the African continent generally is markedly interwoven with colonialism. You know, the first outbreak was exacerbated by missionaries giving unnecessary vitamin injections because that was science, but they weren't changing the syringes, so they gave everybody Ebola. You know, a few more perfect examples of you know, European interference. And you know, the 2013-2016 outbreak in West Africa typified how colonial mindset adversely affects outcomes. Efforts to unilaterally cease all funeral traditions without any proper dialogue with the peoples concerned was a disaster. You know, Traditions and belief systems around death are very important to every culture on earth, including in the West. And people, in West Africa, people hid their sick and dying so they could be dealt with properly, as to do otherwise was just too risky from a culture. It turns out that such funerals was absolutely still possible with care, with discussion about the facts, and with a dialogue. The WHO, for all its good work, is only just getting their heads around that. And then we have what is essentially experimentation, the use of the on Africans without due thought, without their trial. This was done with the noblest of so many colonial projects are. And the organizations realizing negotiation, that's talking to people, folks, not just that's doing stuff, that this was necessary, that they're only just realizing that. It tells you everything you need to know about the way that people think about Africa, numerous people, how they think about them in the West, even people with the noblest of motives. And and there's the reaction in the West. It's shock, it's panic, it's othering, and it's racism. It's colossal overreaction. It does not help that people do not necessarily trust politicians anymore. So when a politician should be guided by science, and they should go, there is no reason why we should stop flight at this point. Ebola just isn't that transmissible. That's a fact. Now, I mean, Western notion that there are backwards people who are superstitious and suspicious, unpredictable. And yet the COVID pandemic has proven that these are human reactions. These are not West African ones. We all know elderly people too scared to go because that's where you die. European. This is natural fear. And I think the behavior in the West has proven that Europeans are more selfish, driven, to be honest. And when you have protests that are led by people armed with the slogans, a few stones thrown at a Sans Frontier truck seems quaint in comparison. And I don't know if you remember this woman. I need a haircut. Feeding into Devil Darling's Fire, into discussions of imperialist supremacist thinking, also my discovery of the crimes of Unit 731. This was a Japanese biological warfare research lab in occupied Manchuria during World War II. This is General Ishishiro. He was one of mankind's most appalling humans. He's a minor character in Devil Darling Spy simply because I wanted people to know his name. He conducted experimentation on he and his unit. He drove the whole project on human subjects. He infected populations with plague. He gave poison sweets to children. The image of the White Devil in Devil Darling Spy was inspired by the way that Unit 731 staff would show up in white coats, aprons, and masks at Manchurian villages, seemingly to help, but in fact, they were there to inject, infect, study, take samples. I guess everybody, I can't talk to their very specific crimes. And I can't show you many of the images that do exist. They are so horrific and I feel sick talking about them. And I guess there's my line. I've left out details throughout this. There's always an extra horrific, sadistic thing done in the name of empire. But here, there's not much left I can say. Even the museum exhibits are terrifying. And, again, this was simply because at this point, the people who were running Japan had convinced the population that they were special, more important. Everybody else was lesser. And so that's how people acted. This is This is what happens. Now, you will want to hear all about the trial and execution of General Ishishiro and his team, but you can't. General and his staff bought their freedom and immunity by sharing their research with the US government. The general almost certainly continued his work at Fort Detrick, Maryland, where human experimentation and bioweapons research was until the 1970s. Are you angry yet? I've written here. That's World War II in a nutshell. You know, war crimes that don't count because we were the winners. Dirty deeds, ridiculous overkill. I take the picture from, that's Dresden in the top left. I take that into schools because I go, are we the good guys? Because those are women and children and they are not soldiers. And we did that to them. And we did that deliberately, knowing what we were doing. Now, also deals with the devil, you know. You know, we left the world in more danger, not less, almost. You know, we tend to consider World War II as the last just war, and there's an element of truth to that, but it's so much more murky than that, so much more morally complex. Now, we like goodies and baddies. We like them simple, we like them clean cut. And we see this in fiction so much. In fact, I worked for the Lego Group for nearly 10 years, and they understood the necessity of a black and white morality, goodies and baddies, and conflicts in children's development. You know, it is how you learn right from wrong. Sometimes you play act the wrong side. Try it out, see how it feels. But you have to grow past that. The Lego company knows this. I mean, it's practically the plot of Lego Movie 2. But if you're a grown adult and you're still seeing the world and history and the Second World War in particular that way, goodies, baddies, black, white, you've got a problem. And in fact, you are a problem. It means you post stuff like this, you know, provided for you by right-wing groups. And this is by no means a UK problem. Few discussion threads between Americans and anyone else don't eventually devolve into somebody saying, you'd be speaking German if it wasn't for us. But the UK has a real problem with how it sees the war and how it uses it in a racist, destructive, self-destructive ways. An empire, it comes up again and again and again. And it's from people who really don't understand what it means because they're never told. They think it means important rather than a 400-year theft, rape, murder, exploitation fiesta perpetrated by one people over another. And because racism has taken hold in this country, you know, it has been in charge. It's been calling the shots for a decade or more. You know, the hostile environment is xenophobic in nature. When people think by accident of birth they are more important and therefore their borders need to be protected. And that's all immigration policy is fueled by this. And the US is still recovering from being run by a fascist dictator. Now, genocide, here's Article 2 of the Genocide Convention again. I am picking one thing here because it's I have the most receipts, essentially. If you take children off their families, put them in cages with portaloos and cover them in tinfoil, if you adopt out those kids, if you start sterilizing Mexican and South American women without their consent, that's genocide. That's the US government has committed that genocide in the 21st century in America. And because that's what it means. And England, you know, the British Empire, people, I mean, this is a contemporaneous cartoon. You know, at the time, there were people who knew that this was wrong, that there was an evil taking place here, you know. And we are actually quite fortunate in the last 18 months that people have become to learn this stuff. Now, there will always be people who will defend statues of slavers by saying, well, it's history, isn't it? What are you going to pull down next? The concert hall that's with that person's name, and you're erasing history. And I mean, it's bollocks. I'm sorry, because what you do is you tear down the statues and then you rename the concert hall. You put a plaque going, this used to be called this because we used to think that slavers were okay. And that this also, by suggesting that, so they're suddenly bad news. No, there were abolitionists back then who were arguing about it, who knew that it was evil. And there's no point in me talking here, really. Dr. Charlotte Lydia Riley says this best. For the British to be ashamed of their imperial history, they would have to know about it. They will have to understand the worst excesses of imperial violence and the simple daily injustice, But people don't care to find out. They exonerate the actions of the people of the past by claiming it was simply a different time with different values. But they want it both ways. They want to be free of the guilt for the sins, but want to be proud of the achievements. The claim that removing the statue is whitewashing history is a pretense that these statues were somehow part of a nuanced conversation about Britain's imperial past. But they weren't. Not least because we have statues to slave owners, no statue to victims of slave trade or victims of imperial violence. And if you don't happen to be from Bristol, up until that statue came down, you probably didn't even know about Colston. That's not history. And this is a battle to be taken up in the south of the US as well. Now, organization, the National Trust, who own a lot of historical places in the UK, took responsibility, and they said, many of the places we care for have direct or indirect links to slavery, including many objects made from materials obtained by forced labor. And what they did is they went through and they said, look at this. This is pretty, but that is material was created by slaves, enslaved people. And they did that. They did a load of that, and people went mad. Please don't educate or lecture us. I don't know what people think the National Trust is for if education is not in their remit. I go around houses to appreciate furniture, art, and gardens. We don't need your view of history forced upon us. And just the idea that they're erasing history is nonsense. They're providing history. History is constantly rewritten as we learn more and as we come to understand more. I also want to talk at this point, because I've had a real go at the Belgians and the Germans. I want to make it clear, this is a list of just some of the more prominent crimes of the British Empire. Famines in India, the Irish potato famine, the Mau Mau uprising, destruction of Ventersburg, the Boer concentration camps, Amritsar massacre, Briggs Plan in Malaysia, the slave trade. Yes, we are so proud that we finished it, supposedly, but we benefited from it for too long. British expedition in Tibet, the partition of India, the Opium Wars, the opium trade, aid and torture centers, Chinese resettlement, Cyprus internment, elimination of Malayan insurgents, and destroying the paperwork. If our history was so important, why did they destroy so much of the paperwork from the colonies that recorded our crimes? Like Hitler towards the end of the war, like Himmler ordered the SS, to destroy all the camps, because important as this was, nobody could know. I did a rough back of a envelope calculation, and that's 57 million deaths in that list, and that's a lot. I can't even get around it. The big problem, our own. When people go, we have to look after our own. We are all our own. I mean, just the notion that we are somehow special, that being born in the UK means that you are more important than anyone else, that you would not want to help somebody whose world has been destroyed by war. It's fundamental misunderstanding, and it's what empire was. It was about taking other people's stuff because they were not as important. And we are doing it. We're repeating this now. It's happening right now. And so, Devil Darling Spy. I told the story of Sarah, who is now the kind of Nazi Shirley Temple figure, who's spying in Berlin, on Berlin high society. They find out about a rogue German doctor who is doing medical experimentation and testing of bioweapons, much like Ishishiro, in Africa, and is sent by the Abwehr to investigate. That's the German military intelligence, and that's all explained why that happens. And I guess the question is, should I be writing this book as a white man? It's a perfectly reasonable viewpoint, completely. And I would say that I thought about this in great detail. I have done my level best to be accurate and to treat the details with sufficient respect. And this book was coming out anyway, so I don't believe I have taken the place of anybody else. And I think that if this book sends one person to investigate writings of people of color, it's been worth it. Kit Dewell said, she was actually quoting somebody else, but she does not specify, don't dip your pen in someone else's blood. And I understand this, but I tread that blood round. I live a privileged existence in what was up until quite recently a very rich country, and it is based and founded in the blood of other people, and I feel it, and I couldn't not act. You know, she said, well, authors have always made things up. Adopting a different viewpoint needs particular care and sensitivity to avoid falling into the trap of cultural appropriation. I hope I have done this. That was my aim. As writers, we have to be the other, because without it, there would be no literature, no great stories, no murder mysteries, no romances, historical novels, no science fiction. But when we become the other, we need to act with respect and recognize the value of what we discover. Show by our attitudes and our acknowledgements that we aren't just appropriating, but are seeking to understand. And I think I've done that. I can't stay silent. And this is why I'm here. It's why I wrote this talk. And I did specifically so I got to rant, because you can't rant like this in school. But I can't stay silent. And the world, because I think there is an emergency. We are undergoing an emergency right now. The UK is sliding into a fascist dictatorship. I think the US missed one by a couple of hundred votes, and still cannot wrest control from, by democratic means, cannot wrest control from the fascists. I think, we have racism, and we have loose in our streets, and I think it's an emergency. All hands to the pumps. Okay, I hope I told you something you didn't know before, and I hope, where are we? I forgot this slide. Yeah, we know our past was imperfect, but we go for pleasure. That's the emergency, because it's less the jackbooted people stomping over and breaking windows. It's the reasonable, the nice people. You know what Naomi Schulman said about nice people? Nice people turn their backs while their neighbors were dragged away. Nice people were the best Nazis. These are nice people. It's an emergency. Thank you. Now, I'm going to see if there are any questions, and I will attempt to. Thank you, Kate. Should I be on mainstream UK TV? I think I swear a little bit too much for that. But yes, people need to be talking about this. I think it is so important. We need to, you know, when people say, don't bring politics into it, everything is politics. Your very existence is politics. You know, the position you have, the job you have, your social status, the kind of fun you can have, it's all politics. And I don't think there are many more important things than getting a handle on racism that runs, you know, and it's the insidious nature that is terrible, I think. You know, there are people out and facing off with the jackbooted Nazis. It's the nice people we need to be worried about. Okay, and do we have any other questions? I don't know whether, Maddie, you have any? I think we're finishing nice and early. I timed that to perfection. Can't hear you, Maddie.
Oh, yeah, you got the timing really well.
Ah, excellent.
I hadn't mute turned on then. When I turned it off after I'd spoken, which is the wrong way round. But yeah, that was a really informative talk, really in depth as well.
Thank you, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to do this, because I think it's we need to be talking about these things. I've run my mouth off now. I'm just going to keep repeating the same words. I'm so sorry.
Okay. Yeah, if we can wait like a minute or so more to see if there's any questions that come in live, but if not, then we're sort of at the end of the time.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for having me. Thank you for listening. Really appreciate it. And you know, you can buy the book in places that sell books if you would like to. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you.
Okay. All right. Thanks a lot.